your buyer personas need to be based on real buyers
Yeah.
making real buying decisions recently, and the discovery that you can have through interviews with real buyers to depict in aggregate how real buyers make these decisions, because that's what your company needs.
In marketing, we often hear we don't know what we're going to say until we know who we're saying it to. And today's Ask an Expert has actually built a business on this concept. Hi, I'm Joshua Carlson, co-founder of Propelo Media. And today I sit down with Adele Revella. She's the founder and CEO of the Buyer Persona Institute. They help companies develop custom buying personas for companies all across the country. Today she's going to talk about how they use a journalistic approach to dig deep into the heart of what these buying decisions are. She's also going to talk about how she's seeing buying patterns change as it relates to COVID. And finally, she's going to share how the worst year of her life working on a project has actually become one of the best things that she's ever done. Now let's hear what Adele has to say. Adele, thank you so much for coming on our Ask an Expert segment. I really appreciate having you on.
Well, thank you, Joshua. I'm delighted to be here.
Okay, so I'm big on origin stories, so I would love to hear yours. You founded and now head up the Buyer Persona Institute, and I would love to hear what started that and how did that process evolve?
Yeah, so I had just sold my training company to a company called Pragmatic Marketing. Some of your listeners may have heard of Pragmatic
Yep.
Marketing. I had built their marketing course. They had a product management course, and I built their marketing course and delivered it for, 10 years.
Wow.
And whenever we did that course, which was, like this was not during COVID, so we were on site, face to face with people
Yeah.
all day for 2 days. And I had an hour of this 2-day course that was about buyer personas.
Mm.
And so at the end of the course, we, hand out all these papers and say, hey, what did you like best? What did you like least? What could we do better? And inevitably people would say buyer personas was the best part.
Okay.
I had an hour module out of 2 days on buyer personas, and people would say, I need more, I want more.
Yeah.
So being a trainer at heart, I decided to start the Buyer Persona Institute with the goal to train marketers to interview buyers and understand what buyers really wanted from the buying experience.
Sure.
And ultimately, we ended up doing a little bit of pivot, and now training's kind of like a minor part of our business, and really mostly we do this research for clients.
Sure.
But that was the inception. I mean, I'm big on listening to the customer and then giving them what they want, and so I was listening to people in these training sessions saying, more on buyer personas, please.
Yeah, well, I love it because I've often said to teams that I've had, you don't know what you're saying until you know who you're saying it to, because it starts with that target audience. So I love this business that you have because it's just taking that and being so much more thorough with it. I'm curious from a persona standpoint, is there a preset or a predefined group of personas you have, or are these just custom every single time?
Yeah, so we've always done them custom for our clients.
Okay.
And the reason for that is that we can, our goal is not to just describe the buyer. We see that as maybe 5 to 10% of the persona. The really crucial and actionable part is understanding how buyers make a particular buying decision.
Okay.
So that's got to be custom. On the other hand, what we did, kind of recently, it's my dog, see her jumping off.
Oh yeah.
What we did recently is we said some people really do just want to know the buyer and they want access to that. And we've done thousands of interviews with B2B tech buyers. And so we did just recently announce that if you just want the buyer profile, that we'll do that for clients. We'll basically dig into our database, understand who your audience is, and then dig into our database and serve up that buyer profile really fast and at a much lower cost than when we do the actual interviews. But again, we think that's like 5 to 10% of the value of the buyer persona, so it's still not our core business.
Well, so let's talk about these interviews that you do, because I think a lot of viewers understand the concept, but you guys really take an incredibly deep dive into actual
Mm.
people. This isn't, just a profile, a model. Like, you guys are having real conversations. Talk us through that process and how that actually works.
Yeah, actually, I just did a rant on LinkedIn last week, which has gotten a lot of attention, saying, stop calling buyer personas fictitious.
Mm,
I mean, there's actually, if you Google what is a buyer persona, you'll see, well, actually, HubSpot now calls it a semi-fictitious, whatever that means.
okay.
Um, but, buyer personas should not be fiction. I
Right.
mean, are you going to trust your decisions to something that's fictional?
No.
And so the number one thing that I hope listeners to this podcast take away is your buyer personas need to be based on real buyers
Yep.
making real buying decisions recently, and the discovery that you can have through interviews with real buyers to depict in aggregate how real buyers make these decisions, because that's what your company needs.
Sure.
They need the truth. The fiction isn't going to get it, guys. We've already been making stuff up,
Right.
Let's not do that with our personas.
Well, there's that old adage, 50% of my marketing's working. I just don't know which 50%. And I think by what you guys are doing is you guys are actually giving clarity on these different attributes in these different individuals during this buying process. I'm curious, from an organizational standpoint, um, do you have a situation where company X comes to you and says, hey, we'd like to do this analysis. We target CMOs because that's the right, that's the person. But your analysis comes back and actually says, whoa, you should actually be targeting COOs because those are the people that actually align to what you're looking at.
Yeah. So again, we're focused on buying decisions,
Mm-hmm.
and for most of our clients, there's more than one person involved in that decision.
Right.
And so we wouldn't probably say that the client was wrong about the CMO. We just say that based on our interviews, we're discovering that there's these other people involved,
Sure.
and that in fact, even though, I'll just go with that the CMO owns the budget.
Yep.
And so a sales team might say, oh, the CMO is the decision maker, because at the end of the day, the sales rep knows he has to get the CMO to sign off.
Right.
But who's doing the evaluation?
Right.
And because as marketers, what we want the persona to do is help inform the marketer's entire process of nurturing that client through the evaluation, that
Right.
prospect through the evaluation. So if chances are it isn't any C-level buyer at all that's doing that evaluation. It's probably a committee led by somebody junior to the C-level buyer.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're really trying to get companies to think about personas with respect to two people. One is there's an economic buyer
Okay.
who makes the economic decision, and then there's a buying committee led by somebody we call the lead evaluator,
Mm-hmm.
who's making the selection decision.
Sure.
And which decision are you trying to influence? And so, because we got to think about this in terms of how are we helping our salespeople really get that deal done?
Right.
And your salespeople are talking to those people who are not that economic buyer. And we've got to be able to give the salespeople tools. We've got to field marketing content. We've got to have things on our websites that's helping that evaluation committee. So you're right, Joshua. It's not just the economic buyer, and we're
Right.
absolutely helping our clients understand that.
Okay. And I'm curious, when we talk about a committee, right? I mean, that presents multiple personalities. How do you, what's the best way to effectively market to try to cater and make sure we're hitting all buttons because there's multiple people involved?
Yeah. Well, through the interviews, and we predominantly interview the lead evaluator.
Okay.
then what we're doing is, and we're talking to people who just went through that decision process. So this
Right.
is the key. Find the lead evaluator who has very recently evaluated different marketing agencies. And the only question that's scripted is the first one. Take me
Okay.
back to the day when you first decided you needed to search for a new marketing agency and tell me what happened.
Right.
And then as you're walking that evaluator through that whole journey, the job is to work like a journalist more than a researcher, work without a script like a journalist would,
Yeah.
to dig into that person's story and get them to talk about all the people on the buying committee
Sure.
and who really had influence on what their questions and concerns were, so that you can get a picture through a small number of interviews, really, of how that buying committee's functioning. And if you're hearing consistently, we've got this guy from finance who is really a big stakeholder in this and is really skewing the way we make selection decisions, then go interview that guy too.
Yeah.
But most of the time, just by talking to the lead evaluator, you can understand that entire committee's influence and how they're making choices.
And so when you guys do this deep dive and you are doing, this unscripted, this journalistic approach, what's the output? I mean, what is the, hey, here's what we found. Now here's how you need to actually leverage this information to drive better success.
Well, first of all, we have to look for patterns, right?
Yep.
And I think that's really the people who say that buyer personas are fictitious. I think what they really meant to say is don't just use any one buyer as an example.
Okay.
And so but I just have this argument with this idea of fiction. And I think it doesn't, if we're going to go do all this work, guys, let's not present it as fiction, because that's not going to impress anybody. But when we look across the interviews, we need to be looking for patterns.
Okay.
And we need to be presenting. So the first thing is present what we heard from the interview.
Yep.
And the way we do that is we look for patterns, and we look for patterns in 5 categories. So we created a model because we needed to, remember, I'm a trainer at heart, and I needed a way to make this, accessible to people who didn't necessarily think like me.
Yep.
And I said, okay, let's look for patterns in 5 areas. First of all, let's look for patterns in what people told us about what we call priority initiatives. Those are the buying triggers. Those are the drivers for getting off my duff and changing something and spending money to solve a problem. Second set of patterns I'm looking for are success factors. And these are like, what does success look like in your buyer's words?
Yeah.
It's like, what are the outcomes buyers expect? Then the next set of patterns I'm looking for, and I'm going to look across all the interviews for anything I heard that were objections, that were like, well, we didn't choose, we were looking at 6 companies and we eliminated 3 of them because they didn't have X, or their salespeople didn't know this, or, we couldn't get this problem solved, or whatever. Anything that we call these perceived barriers. These are perceptions that you need to address as a marketer in order to win their business.
Sure.
The 4th set of patterns we're looking for, we call this decision criteria. These are every single one of the questions we heard the buyers we interviewed asking as they evaluated all their options.
Okay.
And so like my favorite one is ease of use. Like every website you go to, they'll say, hey, our solution's easy to use. Well, that is not really that compelling. So the decision criteria insight would get into like, what about ease of use was important? Like, how much training did you need before it was easy to use?
Right.
And, it gets into all the nitty gritty questions. This is the part that makes me crazy, because somewhere, and I've been in marketing for darn near 40 years. This is all done through the miracle of hair color, even in COVID. And
well done.
Thank you. And guys can wear their hair gray. We just look older. Anyway, and, we learned that we should talk about benefits and not features, right? Like that was a rule.
Yeah, right.
Well, guess what? The benefits are the success factors. The decision criteria are how you prove you can deliver that success.
Mm.
And marketers, as marketers, we don't build nearly enough content that gets into the differentiated way we deliver that benefit. That's what buyers want to hear about. So we're looking for all those questions. That's what we deliver in decision criteria. And then the last category we get is buyer's journey. And those are the steps your buyers take, the resources they trust, all the personas involved, all laid out, all supported by quotes. So that's the first step, is to deliver a persona that has all that.
Okay, so it sounds like a lot of what you're doing, and go back to the word you used, journalistic, which is just really digging and not stopping when you hear the first word, because, to your point, ease of use. Well, what does that mean? Because everybody's website should be easy to use, but really, how is that impacted? Is it load times that you're focused on? Is it, a use case where it's 3 steps instead of 7, and if you don't dig deep enough, then you're going to miss the important factors that are actually ultimately driving that decision.
Exactly. And that's why, frankly, in our company, we don't hire people with research training to do these interviews. We hire people who are either marketers and intuitively know, like, I can't just say ease of use. I've got to go dig for what that means. Yeah. Or, if it's technology, it's fully integrated. Well, what does that mean? Yep. Or, it's like, it's got to be, we care about time to market. Well, what does that mean? We want to get that detail. And, and so people who have been journalists, if you're listening today, you probably automatically were trained how to do that.
Yeah.
But we're looking for that sort of like curiosity factor. People sometimes say, what do you need to do this? Well, you need to be really curious about what those people had to say and what they were thinking.
For sure. Speaking of curious, I'm curious what type of buying changes you guys are seeing now that we're in this. And really, I'd like to apply it to 2 things. So one is, obviously, COVID was the first kind of wave, and that led to some economic issues. And unfortunately, that's really going to seemingly be going on for quite some time. So I'm curious from that factor. But the combination of both of those have exposed the ongoing existence of social issues. So I'm curious from kind of those 2 factors. You've got the health and then the social impacts. What are you seeing from a buying behavior? Are we seeing any changes?
Well, we're in a recession.
Yep.
And I think I'm writing a paper right now on the ROI of buyer personas, and hopefully that'll be out by the time this podcast is out. But I've been through, I had to go look it up, like how many recessions have I been marketing? I've been marketing through 4 recessions, major recessions.
Yeah.
But this one's different. And it's different in 2 respects. One is, it's been like 2008 was the last recession.
Yep.
And I'm talking about the U.S., guys, and I realize you maybe seeing this from elsewhere in the world. But and in 2008, buyers were far more willing to talk to salespeople than they are today.
Okay.
So in every previous recession I've been in, companies cut the marketing budget. First thing to go.
Yeah.
Big expense. You don't really, it's painful, but, in the short run, it isn't that painful, and we can live with it. We just got to get through this thing. And I'm saying that this is the worst time to do that, because buyers are now less willing than ever to talk to salespeople. And, in all the previous recessions, the salespeople still had their live events. They could still go visit customers.
Yeah.
Which is where salespeople really have magic, right?
Yep.
In those interpersonal relationships.
Yeah.
This recession's different. Nobody has those opportunities. We're doing social distancing on steroids, like we're doing this on Zoom. There's no way we're getting together. So that's really what COVID's done. So people initially were frozen, but now the buyers we're interviewing are telling us that the investments they were making pre-COVID, they're still making. And mainly our clients are in tech. So these are pretty much tech interviews we're having.
Yeah.
But they've slowed down. There's more decision makers involved. There's more of a focus on the economics because we're in a recession and so now the CFO or the economic business case is more crucial than ever.
Right. Okay. And what about from social? Are we seeing anything as far as, I think it's been interesting. I had another guest, Samuel Mani, and he talked about how, when it comes to politics or social issues, corporations, have really been given a pass to sit on the sidelines and not get involved. But that's becoming, that's eroding. It's now consumers are looking for organizations to step up. So I'm curious if you're seeing anything from that standpoint.
Yeah, it hasn't shown up in any of our work so far. Again, we're B2B mainly, not B2C, because these kind of interviews work best when, not necessarily because it's B2B, but because it's a high consideration buying decision. That's the real distinction.
Sure. Yeah.
And so, companies, and this is, even just the question of how much does emotion factor into the buyer persona?
Yep.
The more complex the buying decision and the more complex the buying committee, the less emotion plays into that decision.
Okay.
And so, I don't think that's part of why we haven't seen that. I mean, certainly, it's fascinating. Who isn't watching what's happening right now and just sort of seeing, I'm fascinated by it.
I think, from my personal experience, it feels different this time around. And you are seeing, you're seeing change across a wide spectrum. And obviously as a business person, I think to me, I am optimistic that there's some change, and it's interesting. I won't pose this question to you because I don't know really the answer, but from a social standpoint, the question that I'm teasing right now is: are corporations following consumers, or are corporations actually stepping up to lead consumers right now? Right? Is it the consumers that are pulling them, or is it corporations that finally are living up to the thing that I studied, 15 years ago, 18 years ago in college, corporate responsibility, right? What responsibilities do we have? So it's a very interesting, time to see, but it's one that I'm optimistic that there's going to be good change.
Yeah, and I think a lot has to do with whether we are by nature optimistic or pessimistic, right? Because this crisis has certainly given all of us a sort of like, oh my gosh,
Yeah,
I love the meme that went around saying, if anybody asked you where 5 years ago, where you'd be 5 years from now, it was like nobody got it right,
No. Yeah, no,
nobody got it right.
I said early on to a guest, this is unprecedented. And he's like, no, we've been through, recessions before. And I'm like, this is before the social, it's like, no, this really, yes, we've had pandemics and yes, we've had recessions, but like the fact that all of this is hitting at the same time is truly, it's unprecedented.
Yeah. And I don't think they're unrelated. I do think that people's frustration levels personally are higher.
Yep.
And that has, and people are more tuned in.
Sure.
To online news than they ever were. So, if there's a person on the planet who hasn't seen that George Floyd video, it's hard to imagine, and who hasn't wept to see it,
Right. Yeah.
And so, are corporations driving the change, or are the consumers driving? I think it depends. I think it's like everything else. There's a few companies. It's all about the leadership in the company, right?
Correct. Yeah.
And there's a few companies, and I think there are a small number of companies where leadership has really felt the impact and said, we're going to go try to get outside the box on this and try to actually do something that's not just put out we care. And and then there's all the people that are in the middle, but it's like that about just about everything, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think your leadership aspect is spot on. An underlying theme that I've been hearing from many guests right now is a lot of the changes that we're seeing right now. we're not spawned per se by COVID or by the issues that are happening right now. Those changes in these organizations were already kind of forecasted. They were planning towards something
Mm.
along these lines. This has just accelerated a lot of these changes. I think what we have proven is, we can work in a virtual environment. And a lot of companies, I just heard today, Google is saying
2021, yeah.
2021, yeah, exactly. And Twitter has already said, hey, it's entirely up to you if you'd like to permanently work, remote. But these are conversations that have already been had. They may not have been in the forefront, but this event that we're going through right now has accelerated a lot of these changes. Shifting gears here, you've written a book. In fact, as I did my prep for this, I saw one of the testimonials, like, she literally wrote the book on buying persona, because you wrote a book called Buying Persona. I'm fascinated by this topic. I think that content creation is often it's perceived to be challenging. It's perceived to be, I'm not an expert, even though most business owners are in fact experts in their field. I'd love to just hear how that process came about, and then just talk me through the actual book creation process, and what that was like for you.
Yeah, the funniest part of what you just asked me is the title of the book. It's Buyer Personas. And I had, like probably every author, I'd like all these really cool titles in my head, and I'd written them all down and presented them to Wiley. So, most books today are self-published, but this book was published by Wiley. And they came back and said, no, the title of the book is Buyer Personas. And I went, it's like horrible, like how boring. But yeah, so today, and a lot of times people introduce me, she literally wrote the book on buyer personas. So that's true. And it's all because of Wiley. What was the process like for me? It was horrid.
Okay.
I mean, most people think they want to write a book someday. I never did. And I had resisted writing this book for years. My friend, David Meerman Scott, who, have you had him yet on your?
Not yet.
Yeah, David's fantastic, and a dear friend, and used to actually work for me.
Okay.
So insert long story here. And he had been begging me to write this book, and David had written a number of best-selling books.
Yeah.
And finally, he talked me into it. That's really what it was. And so it was partly David. It was partly that he brought me a publisher on a platter.
Yeah.
He said, Wiley will publish this book. Here's the deal. And I didn't have to go beg to have anybody publish it.
Sure.
But the real impetus for me was that I was just, I get invited to speak at conferences. I love public speaking. I'd be keen at doing conference speaking and all, or I'd talk on a podcast or a webinar. I'd have 45 minutes and I could cover this much of what I needed to say.
Right.
So I wrote the book because I wanted to dispel the fantasy that buyer personas were go download a template, talk to a few customers, ask your salespeople, fill in the template, and you're good to go.
Sure.
And so because I'm a trainer at heart, a third of the book is dedicated to literally how to find people to interview, how to conduct the interviews, how to aggregate the results of those interviews, and then how to use those insights to build content and messages and themes, because I am a trainer at heart. And I felt, truthfully, writing that book was the worst year of my life. I hated every minute of it. I just hated it. I love to talk, but put me alone in my room all day long and make me write. I'm like, oh God, I'm done.
Right. Well, so how'd you get through it? Because it's interesting to hear you say that most people want to write a book. And I feel like it's actually, maybe there's a romantic thought like, hey, it'd be great to have a book, but most people don't want to write a book. So I actually would love to hear, like, obviously it was arduous, but how did you get through? Were there techniques that you adopted to kind of make sure you had a regimen to get to the finish line?
Yeah, so I had a ridiculous deadline from the publisher.
Okay.
And the one thing David Meerman Scott told me is no matter what, you can screw up anything you want, but don't screw up. You must make that deadline.
Yeah, right.
And I'm a good planner. I had a blog at buyerpersona.com, which, I got in 2006. And I took every blog post that I'd ever written,
Yeah.
and I organized it all into topics. And I tried to use the blog posts. That didn't work. And then I tried recording chapters, and it was garbage. And I tried hiring somebody to help me write it. And after 2 chapters, I had to fire him. It was just, at the end of the day, I realized the only way I was going to get the book that I really wanted was to just sit down every single day and write. And I mean, was still running a company. My company was growing like crazy.
Sure.
So I just had to allocate time every single day to sit and write that darn book. And I hated it.
Well, that comes through clearly, but kudos to you for being able to, to get through it and to put that level of commitment down. I think time blocking is something that's incredibly important for big things like this. And it's honestly, I think it's at least from my experience in what I've seen from peers, it's underutilized. And I really do think it's a powerful tool to say, hey, I'm going to commit, even if it's just 30 minutes, I'm going to commit this. But when you're doing it every day, every week, every month, suddenly you can make big gains for something that is difficult and arduous like you went through.
And then find if there's anything possible. The other thing I did is I looked throughout every part of my life, personal and professional, to see if there was anything I could get rid of, that like I could sort of like something else I didn't like to do, that I could balance it out. Like, okay, I'm going to pay somebody to do this.
Okay.
So that I can therefore use that time that I was already spending doing something I didn't really want to do that much.
Sure.
And instead I'm going to spend it to do, it's like, you can't pretend your way into liking something that you don't like to do.
No, but this is why I wanted to talk about your journey through it, because I do feel that that accomplishment, and I'm going to ask you about, just what you've seen from the book for your business. But the process, I feel like most people just don't start, right? And so that's why I like talking about this journey, because they just know, right? I'm not going to like this. It's going to be a slog. And so because of that, I'm just not going to start, right? And then, 3 years go by, and, what could have already been done and finished, is just missed. And so hearing people like you say it was horrid is actually good, because I think that that's real, and that people need to understand, it's not like everybody that writes a book is just like, oh, I love writing, so I'm just going to put down all of these ideas. Most people that I've talked to have had challenges, and they've had to figure out ways to overcome it to get to the completion.
I think you learn a lot about yourself writing a book. And if you really do know, like for me, the inspiration for writing, because I still do writing, I've built content, I'm writing this paper, is listening to people who would be the readers of my book ask questions. And so that was the other thing I did, is I really tried to take, everything, every question I'd ever been asked in a workshop, everything that I knew, so that I could write it from the reader's perspective.
Sure.
And I mean, one of my favorite guys is Marcus Sheridan. I don't know if you've had him on. He wrote a book called They Ask, You Answer.
Okay.
It's a marketing book, and it's the whole. And he's a swimming pool guy. He owns a swimming pool company, and so he's got a great story, and he's a fantastic guy.
Okay.
But he talks about, how he got his swimming pool company to be like #1 globally, some little company in Podunk, South Carolina or North Carolina. I don't know, one of those Carolinas. Apologies, everybody. And he got it to be #1 because he wrote everything he wrote was from trying to answer a question. And that's kind of how I approached my book. I'm like, what is my reader? Not what do I want to say, because I think those are terrible books.
Yeah.
Those are terrible talks. Those are terrible everything. If we're going to be a good communicator, then we've got to understand who's our audience and what do they want to hear.
Sure.
And try. And the other problem is, by the time we write a book, we're probably pretty good at whatever we're writing about.
Exactly. Right.
And without that reader's constant perspective, Stephen King. So Stephen King, right? He writes horror novels. I'm not a horror person,
Yeah.
but my favorite Stephen King book is called On Writing.
Mm.
That's the title of Stephen King's book. Now, this is not a bestseller, but I loved that book
Okay.
because he writes about how to write.
Yeah.
And, you know, when he writes a book, and I don't know how many millions of novels he's written and how
A
many
lot.
gazillions of dollars he's made,
Yeah.
but he writes it completely, puts it away, and then takes it out and rereads it as if he's the reader.
Mm.
So we can't be, the problem in my head when I'm writing is I'm trying to be the writer and the reader at the same time. This is probably like multiple personality disorder, right?
Right. Right.
So write as the writer, but then take it out and reread it and read it as if you were the reader, and you'll
Right.
have to rewrite it.
Well, I like this because it kind of gets full circle to your business, which is it's start with the target audience, start with the buyer persona. And if you're thinking from a writing perspective, if you're thinking about who's going to read this, what they want to know, then you're going to grease the wheels and it's actually going to become more valuable, which leads me to what has the value been for your business in writing a book? What have you seen?
It's huge.
Okay.
It's huge. It's worth every bit of blood, sweat, and tears because, you know, it really is the only piece that people have. I get emails from all over the world or LinkedIn contacts from people who say, you know, I'm a student. I'm writing my thesis on buyer personas. I'm like, really? Like, are you crazy? And you know, it's really the work out there that has become like the authority on the talk, and it's really has not as fast as I'd like, but it's shifted so many people's perceptions. And then from a business perspective, let's just go to the revenue side.
Sure.
You know, I can't tell you how often my sales guy will say, you know, we just got a lead. The person read your book and they just want to know how much it costs and where do they start.
Yep.
So David Meerman Scott said this to me, and he's right about a lot of things, but he was really right about this. He says, a book is the only piece of marketing literature that you will ever be asked to autograph.
Yeah, that's well said. Yeah, I mean, and so I'm glad to hear you say this, and I've asked this, I've had a number of guests who have written books, but this is, I think, what you went through. I think this encapsulates what I feel like has been talked about for several years, which is, hey, if you're an authority figure, and most business people are, like they're running a business that, you know, it could be plumbing, it could be landscape,
Yeah.
I mean, whatever it is, you're an authoritative figure in that area. Writing the book is such a great vehicle for you to put your name out there as an industry leader. Now, it's just like all content, and you said it, it can be slow going, but
Yeah.
it pays dividends in the long run. And also what I think is interesting is you said this, you learn more about yourself. And I think this process can help you refine yourself and your approach and your business as well. So, so thank you so much for sharing. Because I just, like I said, the pain, I feel like people just shy away from it because they do think it's going to be arduous. So I'm glad to hear
And
you
I
share
think
that.
for most people, and knowing whether you're an introvert or, I mean, my favorite definition of introversion versus extroversion.
Okay.
Extroverts get their energy from being with people, and then they can go be alone for a while.
Right.
Introverts get their energy from being alone, and they can go be with people for a while. I'm married to an introvert. I'm obviously an extrovert. And, you know, writing a book is a very lonely thing. So you've got to balance. If you know that about yourself, like, okay, this is going to sap energy from me.
Yeah.
Then I'm going to have to go find something else to do the rest of the time to restore that energy. Because
Sure.
if I don't, and for me, it's talking to my customers, you know, it's interviewing people.
Yeah.
That gives me the energy to go then sit down and write. If I'm
Right.
just sitting there trying to write, my energy, somebody wrote an article once that said writing made them sleepy.
I can see
That's
that.
how I feel about it. It makes me want to take a nap, you know?
Sure. No, I totally get that. And fellow extrovert as well. So I get that sentiment. Well, so last question is, if you could go back in time, you've had quite a journey, but like, if you were to give yourself something, you know, advice about, hey, approach this differently as you're starting out in your career, what do you think you might go back and say to yourself?
Oh, I just did a LinkedIn post about this
Oh,
last month
okay.
because it's the best career advice I ever got. Here's what it is.
Yep.
When you're thinking about what you want to be someday, or even I don't care how old you are, you're 60. What do you want to do when you're 70?
Yeah.
Don't think about what you want to be. Think about how you want to spend your day.
Mm, I like that.
How do you want to spend your day?
Right.
And that should drive your career. That's my number one advice. I once thought about before I built that training company, I thought about starting a landscaping company because I love to landscape.
Okay.
And then I started thinking about how would I actually spend my day? What would I actually be doing? Who would I be interacting with? And then I looked at what were the best days I'd ever had in my career. Two things. Mentoring the people. I was a CMO for a long time. I ran sales and marketing. Mentoring my team and public speaking. So what did I do? I built a training business where I
Right.
got to mentor people and public speak.
Right.
Best gig I ever had.
I love it.
That's my advice. How do you
Yeah.
want to spend your day? Think about what was the best day you ever had. Whenever I interview people to hire for my team, that's what I
Sure.
ask them. What were you doing?
Yeah, no, that's a great paradigm shift to, what do I want to be, to how do I want my day to actually be? Because it's the old question, is it the journey or is it the destination? And I think the reality is
Journey.
you focus on your journey and you'll end up where you end up.
Because if you're having fun, if you that old one too, do what you love and for your work, and you'll
Yep.
never work a day
Right.
in your
Yeah.
life, right? So we've heard all those. They're all just like, yeah, yeah. But it's like somebody had actually said that to me one time. How do you want to spend your day?
Love it. Well, Adele, I want to thank you very much for coming on. It's been a wonderful conversation, and I look forward to having you back on.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Joshua. I appreciate being here.
Thanks.